Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. It's pawpaw season, so today we have a very timely episode for you all. An interview with Neal Peterson of Peterson Pawpaws. Neal has spent decades working with Asimina triloba, collecting fruits from orchards across the eastern United States and improving the largest tree-ripened fruit of North America into the 7 named cultivars that we know so well today. In this episode, we take a deep dive into Neal's breeding work and much more. Stick with us. So Neal, why don't we just jump right in and start off with your background and how you were brought to your work with pawpaws?
Well, my goodness, that's could be a long story because it goes back to my teenage years. I had a strong interest in the trees and plants and birds of where I lived in southern West Virginia. It's kind of self-taught naturalist. So yeah, I'm pretty good at identifying the trees and all and the spring wildflowers. That was my first acquaintance with the pawpaw tree. But there was no fruit on the tree, not that I noticed. So it was many years later then that happened. In between, though, there was some significant events that kind of led me up to it. I had some informal experience in plant breeding. The first one was with marigolds. I liked them. They were easy to grow. So I had a strip of marigolds growing, and at the end of the season, I would collect seeds and replant the following year. Did this for 3 or 4 years. And the strange thing I started to notice was each year they were blooming later, which did not please me because I wanted the flowers, right? And after seeing 3 years of this, I kind of hit upon what was happening. I waited till the very end of the year to collect seed. So I was collecting seed from the plants that were late flowering. It was unintentional, but that's what was happening. So every year, my method of collecting seed at the very end meant that there was this artificial selection for late flowering. So that was it. I found that interesting. And then when I was in studying for a degree in agricultural economics, and that was at Michigan State University, a friend had a big garden. He had a small farm, a big garden. He gave me room to plant some of the corn that I'd been saving and informally breeding on my own. I guess I began to see what a large scale project that could be, where you're planting a quarter of an acre of corn and maybe the following year a full acre of corn, and you're supposed to be somehow making sense of the colors of the ears of corn. It was more than I can do, but it was good practical experience in what can be personally entailed when you take on a big project. I got into the pawpaws when I was at West Virginia University, and that would have been from the years 1972 to 76. I think it was in 74 when I was leading a class I was a research instructor, not a researcher, I was an assistant to the class and had a lab. And this took me down to the Arboretum along the Gila River. And it was fall, it was September. The pawpaw season was upon us. And there was down near the river a lovely patch of pawpaws, and the fruit was ripe. And I thought at this time, I knew by this time I'd been reading Yule Gibbons and I was stalking the wild asparagus and some of this. And so now I was very curious. Well, what does a pawpaw taste like? They're supposed to be good. And I went down on a Saturday, and there the fruit was just lying in the leaves, as it will do when it falls off the tree when it's ripe. And I had my first taste of pawpaw, and it was incredible. I mean, it was better than I had been led to believe it would be. I mean, I thought this is like having some sort of wonderful peach, or some other fruit you could compare it to. And this is just wild. Peaches, orange, apples, all these things have had thousands of years of human selection going on, and then in the 19th and 20th century, a lot of scientific breeding has been involved in these fruits. Here it's a fruit that tasted just as good in the wild. But I also recognized right away, it's like, well, this has a lot of seeds in it. That's not the case with a peach where you only have one pit in the middle. So I thought, what this needs, if it's to become something that we could cultivate and domesticate, it's because nobody's out there, growing pawpaws right as a fruit. It's just if you happen to be in the woods at the right time. And so this has real potential. But one of the first things we would have to do is we would have to have special varieties that are as improved from the wild as the peaches we grow are improved from the wild peaches of China. Those wild peaches of China just had a nice thin layer of that sweet flesh around the pit. And over the years now, we've selected for a nice quantity of flesh that surrounds the pit. So that got me started.
So Neal, if you could briefly describe basic information about pawpaw in terms of what its hardiness zone is or its preferred growing conditions,
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
right. Here's a quick rundown on what a pawpaw needs to grow well. It needs well-draining soil. So no hard pan and heavy clay is not favorable. A perfect soil, you don't have to have perfect soil, but a perfect soil would be a silt loam or a sandy loam. And they love moisture and they need that good drainage. The soil should be moderately acid. They will not grow in alkaline soil. So soils out west, which are almost all alkaline, are no go. They need rainfall. They're suited to the summers of the eastern United States. So we're talking about humidity and rainfall and heat. Getting up north into Canada, the growing season would be too short for the fruit to ripen. They will grow, though, I know, up into New England successfully and ripen, and around, say, Minneapolis in Minnesota, which is 100 miles north of their native range. But you can grow them in southern Michigan, southern Ontario, like I say, into New England. But the high altitudes, like the Adirondacks, is too high. They won't grow in the Adirondacks. So once again, we're thinking about growing season for that issue. I've known people who had terrible times on Long Island growing them. The reason wasn't the soil. The soil's fine, the climate is fine, but Long Island being close to the ocean, constant wind, and pawpaws have very large leaves, and it just kind of rips their leaves up. So in an area of high, constant wind, that would just be a no-go. And sunshine, I guess I can add that they are shade adapted, but you won't get much fruit in the shade. So they can grow to be a beautiful tree growing under taller trees. But for fruit, which is what most people are interested in, you want to have them in at least where they have half a day's full sunlight.
Okay, so my next question focuses on the history of pawpaw in North America. I've read a bit about how megafauna, millennia ago, ground sloths evolved with this species. And, part of the reason why the seeds are so big in the fruit is that they co-evolved with ground sloths to move it around the continent. For our listeners, really interesting topic to kind of like take a deep dive into. And also native peoples. I mean, native peoples obviously also interacted with this tree in forest environments. And although there's not a great amount of research out there or written literature to show exactly what their interactions were like, we can assume that they improved quote unquote wild populations over millennia, and that when we use the term wild, we don't really know what a pawpaw looked like 2,000 or 4,000 years ago, but we know what it looks like today. And native peoples and megafauna all were involved in that coevolution together. Could we talk a little bit about the history of pawpaw? And I know that you especially are well versed in its more recent evolution in the 1900s and 1800s. If we could talk about that, I think would be really valuable to listeners.
Oh, yes. The history of pawpaws. Well, I had to learn that myself. My inclination was I was studying plant genetics, by the way, at West Virginia University. So, I mean, this just fed right into my existing interest in plants and breeding, which is some of the reason I knew about the history of, say, oranges and peaches. So it's like, I have to find out what's already been done with pawpaw. I knew it because it's a native plant, and it's a very interesting small tree in the woods. But I also knew that, it's not being grown domestically. Sometimes in Appalachia, you'll see somebody who has one growing in their yard because they like the fruit. There's a small minor tradition in Appalachia of foraging for the fruits, the same way that people will go foraging for ramps in the spring, mushrooms at different times of the year. So I said, I need to go to the library and see what's been done, partly because as a grad student, I've already been trained to not reinvent the wheel. If you're going to do some work, you find out what other people have done and you build on the work that's already been done. So when I went to the library, I'll be honest, I was expecting only to find references to pawpaw in books that are like The Flora of Virginia, The Flora of West Virginia, but there was more. This was when it became exciting. I found by going through the card catalog that in 1916, the American Genetics Association had sponsored a contest for the best pawpaws, and they had offered a prize of $100 for the prize-winning fruit. That in modern dollars would be about the equivalent of $2,000. I think that would be a very attractive prize. That would catch people's attention. And they had many entries from across the country, from as far away as Kansas. Pawpaws grow natively from the Chesapeake Bay out to the edge of the Great Plains, and from Louisiana, Mississippi up to lower Michigan. They cover an area, 26 states have pawpaws growing in them natively. So this contest received something like 80 entries, mostly from the Midwest, which is where traditionally most of the interest in pawpaws has been. And there was a Mrs. Ketter. She lived in Ironton, Ohio, and her fruit was the best. It was the prize winner. It apparently was heads and shoulders above the other good fruit that was sent in. And you might, scratch your head a little bit. Pawpaws are so perishable. How can you send fruit, from Kansas to Washington, D.C., where the editors were? How could you send fruit, that distance and expect it to get in any good shape? Well, the answer is the railroads. They were incredible. They're better than today. You could load your package in Chicago, and in 24 hours, it's in Washington, D.C. at Union Station. So Mrs. Ketter, I'm sure, used a post going by railroad, and it would, in less than 24 hours, it's in D.C. And they described the fruit. It's really a nice write-up in the article. I don't have it in front of me, but they said that, it was very impressive. It had a thicker skin. It was large. It was very fleshy with excellent flavor. And they felt that in all the sort of entries they were receiving would be the foundation for future breeding purposes to improve the pawpaw, where it could become a contribution to agriculture. Because, like I say, it was not being grown in any orchards for sure, and only rarely, in people's yards. I think it was primarily, say, hunters. They're out there, and now think back to, like 1900 and 1910. Most of America is still rural. Maybe half the country is urbanized in cities like Philadelphia and New York City. But, it's still a rural country with rural traditions. And so fall is a time to go out hunting squirrel and deer. If you're hunting squirrel, it's about the same time that the pawpaws are ripe. And it would be very delightful to be in the woods and have something you could just pick up ready to eat, a sweet treat, without any written evidence behind this. But I think, given the way in which the frontier was developed by European Americans as they moved west and were sometimes in conflict, but not always in conflict with Native Americans, they were learning about the woods. I actually expect it to be the case that in some instances, Native Americans were telling the white settlers where the best pawpaws were. But most of these pawpaws got cleared. It's written in some of the books that how, as the settlers moved down the Ohio River and into the valleys along the Ohio River and its tributaries, that pawpaws were an indicator of excellent soil. And so these were the areas that they would clear the forest to plant corn and set up their farms. So in the process, I'm sure many pawpaw groves were eliminated. Ah, yes, I made it my business. I said, I think I could take on a project of growing and selecting better pawpaws, but I would have to start with the best germplasm, because this is a fundamental tenet of plant breeding, just like with horse breeding. If you think that you're going to breed some thoroughbred horses, you don't start with just an ordinary horse. You find some of the best stock that's out there, and that's your breeding stock. So if I was going to breed pawpaws, which I was pretty sure I was going to do, the year was 1976, I would say at that point, if I'm going to breed pawpaws, I'm going to have to find the old ones that were from from that contest, and also some historic collections that amateurs had put together. Prominent among the amateurs was Dr. Zimmerman. He was a medical doctor, practiced in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, lived, I think, about 20 miles outside the city in Linglestown. And he had, in the 1920s and 30s, he had probably the collection of every named cultivar he could find. So these were grafted because pawpaw, you cannot root a cutting of a pawpaw tree. That's been, so many people have tried and failed. That's a well-established fact. The way you propagate a clone is to graft it onto seedling rootstock. I spent about 3 years. By this time, I had moved to Michigan for grad school studying agricultural economics. And so I had this avocation in my spare time and my vacations to continue the pawpaw research. Could I track down old historic collections? And I visited the Buckman farm. Of course, he had been dead a long time. Benjamin Buckman lived near Springfield, Illinois, and he had a small collection of about 10 named cultivars in 1916. Well, that field, not much to my surprise, the house still stood, but the rest of the farm was corn and soybeans. I went to John Hersey's place near Downingtown, Pennsylvania. That's a little west of Philadelphia. There were trees still there. Nothing, of course, is labeled. I was not impressed by anything there. I then did find Dr. Zimmerman's property. He had died in 1941 of a heart attack. And that's kind of a sad story about Dr. Zimmerman. He was so interested in pawpaws that he had started doing breeding of them and making hybrids with some of the Florida species. He discovered the Florida species because he had a winter home. I guess he was a doctor with enough money. He had a winter home near Tampa, Florida. So he started doing some crossbreeding, hybridizing with Asimina triloba. And this was all written about in 2 articles he submitted to the Journal of Heredity. In his last article, he submitted in 1941, and he died later that year of a heart attack. It's like he started his work basically when he retired from his medical practice. And it's like, this is a tree. This is a tree that from seed to flowering takes about 7 or 8 years. And I don't think you should start breeding trees when you're 65. There's just not enough lifespan left ahead of you. But let's see if I can compute, maybe I was about 32. I said to myself, Neal, if you start now, you're doing it right. You have enough time. That was a correct decision on my part because I was starting at about age 32, and now 40 some years have passed, and I have produced 7 varieties and released named varieties that are really good. But those came from my work that I was describing while I was at Michigan when I found some old collections. I started collecting fruit. Most of the very best stuff came from the Blandy Experimental Farm, which is Boyce, Virginia, and east of Winchester, Virginia. They had a collection. the director of that farm, of the Blandy Experimental Farm, had been in communication with Dr. Zimmerman, and Dr. Zimmerman's widow had donated material to Blandy after Zimmerman's death. And they also, Dr. White, who was the director, had an interest for years in pawpaw, and it was secondary to the work at the Blandy farm. But he had quite a number of projects under his hat with the staff that they were doing. So they planted, as I found out, trees in the backwoods. It kind of happened like this. I tracked down through the literature that I knew Blandy should have pawpaw trees, some sort of collection. So I go visit them. It wasn't too hard to do. I knew exactly where they were, and I had a probably fall vacation about this time of year that I pay them a visit, and they were really, at this point, their staff was so low, they were down to a director and one staff member. Part of it was, I think, that the endowment that had been left by Mr. Blandy, the endowment had kind of been eaten up by inflation. It's one of the unfortunate facts about money, how inflation low and just kind of eats up the value of a trust fund. So we looked at the pawpaws behind their headquarters. It's now the State Arboretum of Virginia, by the way. So it's very lovely place on probably over 200 acres of fields and arboretum. And there was fruit. It was fall, and there was fruit. And I thought, well, it's okay fruit. It's not terrific. I've seen just as good in the wild. I talked to the director. I said, do you have other pawpaws on the property than these 5 trees that I've seen? And, he pauses a little bit as he thinks about it and says, well, there might be some trees in the backwoods, kind of like in the back 40. So that's where I headed to. I drove to that backwoods. It was primarily oak trees, big trees, as woods goes, a very fine woods. Lots of underbrush of all manner of sorts. Spice bush leaps out to me because I remember it being there. And then as I drove slowly down the road, I did see small pawpaws on the left. So, okay, this is where I parked. So I parked the car and I walk through those small pawpaws and the attendant poison ivy, which there was plenty. And as I go deeper into that part of the woods, the pawpaw trees are getting larger. And I reached this point where there are some really big pawpaws, as thick as my leg and 30 feet tall or more, with no low branches because they're all growing under these huge red oaks and other types of oak trees. Well, at least I said, these are old trees. And I look for the next big pawpaw, and then I look for the next. And wouldn't you know it, they all lined up in a row. And they were all similar size, and they were all about 10 feet apart. And I said, okay, these have been planted. That was the major thing. These are not wild pawpaws. This clearly have been planted by people. So I did a little more exploring further into the woods, and there was a parallel row of trees, pawpaw trees, the same size. So now I knew I'd hit pay dirt. So that's where I came to the next year, the next fall, and the following fall, and getting familiar with the trees and putting labels on them so I could keep track in my records of what I was doing. And there was a tree called which I labeled as BEF 53, put an aluminum tag on it. That was the mother tree for my variety, which I call Susquehanna. And its neighbor, which might actually have been just a sucker off of that tree, but had a label of BEF 54, that one is the mother tree of my variety called Potomac. And then there were 3 other of my varieties that had their mother trees in those woods. And so it took years, though. I had to get permission. I needed someplace to plant. I knew if you're going to do plant breeding, it's a numbers game. You're looking for something rare and special, and it's not being rare. Your chances of finding it require that you grow lots of different seedlings. So I had the hopes to grow more than 1,000 seedlings. I got cooperation from the University of Maryland to I have an orchard on their Eastern Shore of Maryland farm, and I was able to plant out about 900 trees there. They were a huge help to me because They prepared the soil, rototilled the rows, and a couple other staff members helped me in the spring plant the seedlings. I'd grown them in a greenhouse. So we planted out 12 rows, about 900 trees, and they were all young. They were just 1 year old, and the tops were only about 10 inches tall. And I had no idea how they were going to do because I'd always seen, and I think this is typical of anybody who knows their wild pawpaws, I'd always seen them growing in the woods under other trees. So they're in the shade. And now here we're going to plant them in the sun. Well, we're going to plant them in the sun because we have no other choice. And if you're going to do this type of an experiment, you're not going to be planting in the shade, right? And I did have trepidation. It's like, we're planting all of these and they may not like being in the full sun, but it turned out very favorably. The first year in the sun, only 10% of them died. And that was really about the only mortality I had. I said, 10% mortality, I'm doing really good now. So maybe, now I have about 810 trees to keep track of, but they're little, and I didn't have any flowers until the 7th year of growth. So now with this, and even in that first year of flowering, only a few set fruit, and that's to be expected. I mean, it's very good if you go into this sort of thing that you know what to expect. It's in fact, you're not taking on an easy project. And I guess I surprised myself that I attempted this and seemed to have done well. The next year was when I got sizable amount of fruit. And I did evaluations of what I had. Now, not all the trees were blooming yet, but I did evaluations of what I had and keeping data on fruit size and flavor and how seedy they were. And I was very optimistic. And I said, I'm saving seed from the very best trees now, and I'll plant that out. The following year, I repeated the procedure. And very interestingly, none of the trees that looked good the first time were now in the top tier because there are many more trees now fruiting. And so this is part of the lesson, is that you can't be too quick to make your judgments because particularly in trees, it's not like tomatoes where they have just one annual year of growth. You have to let the trees continue to mature and get multiple years of evaluation. I chose to do the evaluation for 3 years because, even though it might be preferable to do it for 5, I also wanted to be able to make some discernible progress. So I kind of said, I'll do it for 3 years. And I had relied primarily on my own taste buds for evaluating and those of some friends, but I never had a consistent panel of friends evaluating for taste. And that disturbed me because your scientific methods have to be consistent. I had the second orchard. So this is the first time I've mentioned that a second orchard, but I planted the first orchard. I continued to collect fruit from Blandy and some other places. So it was 2 years later that I planted a second orchard, once again, courtesy of the University of Maryland. This time it was out in Western Maryland. I was living in Washington, D.C. I was working for the Department of Agriculture in D.C. And on weekends, I would drive over to the Eastern Shore, which was an hour and a half minimum drive, depending on whether there was a football game at Annapolis that weekend. But I would drive over there to check on the trees. Then the Western Maryland station, it was in the opposite direction, where I also have to drive an hour and a half to get to it. All I can say is I kind of lucked into it. I had not planted these orchards the same year. They were about 2 years apart in planting. So when I was done with the orchard number 1, evaluating it, and then I launched into orchard number 2. So there was the second orchard with 600 trees. And this time I was able to have some great volunteers who would commit themselves to helping me at the second orchard. It was a slightly different setup where with the first orchard, I would bring the fruit back to my house in Washington, and people would come to my house to taste the different fruit, and I would have tables with paper plates and the fruit with its number on it. So I would could have, more than 100 paper plates for people to taste. At the second orchard, we did it all out at the experiment station. And John Popenow and Steve Kretzman, myself, and Johnny Beck would converge on the station in the morning. We would work 5 days a week out there. First, we would go through the rows of trees, picking fruit that was ready to be picked, putting it in paper bags, writing a number on the bag, the number being the number of the tree. And we'd haul that down to the building at the station and put it on shelves to let them finish ripening. And we would have there on other shelves, waiting for us, bags of fruit that we collected 2 days before. So now we'd have to get to work. We'd had sheets of paper with columns of the different traits we were tasting. I mean, we'd have a column that would say, like, well, how attractive was the fruit? What was the aroma like? When you cut it open, it has a different aroma. What was that cut aroma like? Then how sweet was it? Like from scale of 1 to 5, how sweet was it? Well, how about bitterness? Because you can encounter bitterness in pawpaw fruit. Then there's a flavor which is like turpentine, which you can encounter. We'd have to grade the texture of the fruit. And all these were just in scales of 1 to 5. The only quantitative scale we were using was fruit weight. So we would weigh the fruit, and when we were done with tasting the flavor components, then we would clean the seeds and we would weigh the seeds. So we then had a comparison we could make. What was the ratio of the fruit weight attributed to seed weight? And that's a nice, there you have a very physical measurement. We would do that every day. And in the middle, at the peak of the harvest season, we would be there from 8 in the morning till 4:30 in the afternoon, and your tongue would wear out. You just couldn't help that, but you had to get through the bags you had for the day, because the following day there'd be more. So it was quite an exercise and demanding, but I had consistent taste panel that time. And from that orchard, there were 2 trees out of 600 that were clearly, well, there were more than that. There were actually, I looked out of 600, I chose 9 as in the top tier, but then that got whittled down to the 2 best, and they were clearly better than the other 7. At the first orchard, I also, out of 900 trees, I chose 9 as well, and out of those, there were 5. So you can kind of see the numbers game. I'm choosing 1%, 9 trees out of 900 is 1%. And if I was doing this with my own funds, because this was not my job. This was my avocation. This was why I was spending weekends and vacation time, because this was not my job. My job, I was employed as an economist studying matters about farms, particularly small farms. But it certainly was convenient that I was in agriculture. I like agriculture in most of its aspects. I know that had I had funding behind me, I could have endeavored to have done it on a larger scale. Say if you're raising petunias, and you'll plant acres of petunias just to find a couple that are good enough to name and release in a nursery trade. So I feel pretty good about it, though. I got from 1,500 trees, I narrowed it down to 18, and those got narrowed down ultimately to 7. And those are the ones that are listed on my website. I guess we need to tell our listeners that to make pawpaws more popular and to get the word out to the world about what's there, I mean, I'm not only tooting my own horn, I've got a lot of information on how to germinate seeds, how to harvest the fruit and store it, and the history of pawpaw endeavors. That's petersonpawpaws.com.
So, Neal, from the beginning of when you were working with pawpaws to present day, how do you think pawpaw culture has changed in that time period?
We go from a period around 1990 and 2000 where at a typical talk, where I'd be out invited somewhere to address an organization like the Northern Nut Growers Association. Over the years, I would give numerous talks, and it was so consistent that, my first question before I'd even probably show the first slide is, okay, we have 100 people in this room. How many of you know what a pawpaw is I get about 10 hands in the room. Oh, okay. How many of you ever tasted a pawpaw? One or two hands go up. It's not that way anymore. That's why we're having this interview today. It's become crazy. If you make use of Facebook, you will find that there are about five, it could have gone up to six now, six different Facebook groups devoted to pawpaws. What are they reinventing the wheel? I don't know, but I mean, the old one is Pawpaw Fanatics. There's Pawpaw Fan Club, Pawpaw Planet, Pawpaw Chronicles. There's still something else, and there's a lot of overlap. A lot of people are members in both, in different groups. The Fanatics, which is the oldest group, is Americans, and they are fanatics. It's kind of a wonderful group of people because they're crazy. A lot of them love going into the woods to forage for pawpaws. Pawpaw Fan Club is or was largely European. Pawpaws are not native to Europe. They're strictly native to North America. I haven't even touched on you. You were asking about the megafauna and the Native Americans. I haven't really touched on that. Actually, I think the Europeans are maybe in a better position to grow pawpaws than we are, because to them it's exotic, and the pawpaws you find in the wild are just average pawpaws, whereas over there they are, for the most part, growing cultivars, named cultivars like my own or like Jerry Lehman's, and there are others. Oh, that's a whole nother topic. Since the advent of the Ohio Pawpaw Festival in 1999, people are out there in the woods finding pawpaws they especially like, and then propagating and naming them. I think it's all across the board. I think many of them really are good, but there's no guarantee, because oftentimes they're very quick to do this. They're excited about pawpaws. They find a pawpaw in the woods that they like. They bring it home by grafting, and the next thing you know, they're promoting it. So this will all sift itself out in the future and will get winnowed out. So right now, it's like Mao Zedong said years ago, let a thousand flowers bloom. So that's what's happening with pawpaws right now. So we probably gone from a time around 1980 when there was about 4 or 5 named pawpaws you could buy, and now we have probably over 30 named pawpaws in the trade. But in America, there's still a lot of emphasis on planting your own seed and growing a seedling tree, or maybe propagating from the woods. But there is also a very healthy nursery interest going on. You can buy anything from from a nursery. You can buy a seedling tree, which is no name. You won't know what you're going to get, to the different named cultivars. Jerry Lehman's are really good. Kentucky State University has had a research program to study Asimina triloba since 1994. And so they've, over the years, selected better ones, and they have Atwood, Benson, and Chappelle. There are 3 there. They've released 3 varieties from Kentucky State University. There's myself. Woody Walker has a couple. One's called Kentucky Champion. I remember that name. They're names I don't associate with people. I just know the names. There's Jerry's Big Girl, Quaker Delight, on and on and on. If you do some Google searching, you can find many of these named varieties. I think the Kentucky State University website is a good source of information.
One that I just planted this past year is NC-1, which I think has an interesting history because that one was selected in Canada, or really far north, by Doug Campbell, I believe.
That was selected, Doug Campbell. I think it's called Niagara on the Lake. So it's it's just very near Niagara Falls in Ontario. We don't know why it's called NC1. That's the name he gave it.
Neal, thank you for the history. Thank you for all of the work you put in over the years. I think Your varieties were the first cultivars that I've ever tried, and I stumbled into a research orchard in Missouri that had a lot of your cultivar.
Oh, okay.
There's even like a YouTube video of this incident. The first one, of course, that I tried was a gigantic Susquehanna, and I just was giddy as a schoolboy. And it was huge and had very few seeds. Absolutely delicious. To get inspired other people to go out, hopefully, and try pawpaws and try your varieties. You went into a little bit about
Some of the people over the years that have done some great work improving pawpaws. So I'm wondering for those listening who may want to get in the world of pawpaw improvement, who might be a little bit younger and have a few generations of trees in them that they could work with, and they want to sort of carry the baton and help improve the species even further in terms of controlled crossing, or maybe going back and finding older wild trees that are out there, getting genetics. Where should someone start, do you think?
I think the place to start if when you're going to undertake your own breeding program of pawpaws. So I'll be mentioning several aspects. One is that you have enough land to plant out a good many. I think we should be thinking in the hundreds when you're attempting plant breeding. You can grow the pawpaws very close together in my orchards because this wasn't to be commercial fruit production. This was fruit evaluation. So the trees were planted 3 feet apart. Now the rows were about, you can plant the rows however wide you want to, but you should think about being able to get equipment down the rows. I think my rows were 12 feet apart. So you can squeeze quite a number of trees onto a small space. But remember that you're looking for something unusual, and what's unusual doesn't show up readily. The way you find it is by the numbers game. You plant enough of them that you think the odds will now be in your favor. The other thing is to have an idea of what it is you're looking for. It helps, are you concentrating on flavor or size or seeding, lack of seeds, fleshiness, maybe the ability to be an early ripener in some parts of the country, like up in the north in New England, New York State, Michigan. Early ripening varieties are important. If you're down in Tennessee and Alabama, that's a non-issue. So have goals in mind. And remember, do some reading about the whole subject of plant breeding. You don't have to pick up the highest end scientific book where you may not understand the vocabulary, but learn from what others have been doing. One of the primary principles of plant breeding is that you list your objectives. Now, every time you add another objective to your list, you have basically slowed down your progress by about half. So for me, thought I'm going to keep it pretty. I didn't consider like the seasonality of the ripening period. That wasn't on my list, but fruit size, flavor, fleshiness were on my list. And a fourth thing on my list was yields. You wouldn't necessarily have to have that, but I knew from the literature that pawpaws are notoriously poor yielders. They certainly are if they're in the woods. You can often find a patch, and many of the patches you will find may have only a few fruit, though there are like 50 trees. Well, they're in the shade. Fortunately, once you get them growing in the sun, they have more productivity. So that's another thing to bear in mind as you get into doing your own breeding, is to have a short list of what you're looking to accomplish. And it's also good to think about, well, maybe I should try to do something that other people aren't doing, because then that would be a real contribution for everyone. And the last thing is to remember to start with good germplasm. So if you start with, named cultivars, and they seem to be the ones that have the traits you're already looking for, you're going to be already halfway home. Understand that there's important record keeping to be done, that you'll have to, number your trees. You'll have to have maps of the trees, because it seems like in gardening, and I'm not just talking plant breeding, just in gardening, you have labels on the different plants you're growing, and over the years, the labels disappear. You don't know where they went, but you no longer have a label. That's why maps are very important, because you can always reestablish the identity of a seedling or a particular bush or tree. Now, and it takes patience. In my story, I used 3 years of data before choosing to analyze the data and make my choices. 3 years is not necessarily enough. I'll illustrate that with some of my experience. So from the first orchard, I now had like 9 very promising candidates. And I had my own opinion of what they were, but recall that particularly when it comes to taste, everybody's taste buds are different. Like think about apples. Some people like a sweet apple, a tart apple, a crunchy apple. So since I wasn't breeding just for myself, my intention was let's up the level and the standard of pawpaws so that everybody will want them the way we enjoy peaches and apples. What I did was I got permission from a farmer's market in Washington, D.C. to bring pawpaws to the market in season. And then I had them all labeled in their boxes. We give out free samples and things like that, but I could begin to get feedback from customers as to what they really liked. And that was very, very important. You wouldn't necessarily, as a backyard breeder, have to go to a farmer's market, but do go get the opinions of other people of what is good, and don't rely just on your own opinion. You're just one person, and if you're serious about this, you want something that other people will like too.
That's great advice. Thank you.
So Neal, of your different cultivars, Allegheny, Potomac, Rappahannock, Shenandoah, Susquehanna, Tallahatchie, and Wabash, is there a favorite fruit of the bunch?
Yes. I'm sure this should be everybody's favorite, right? After what I just told you about different taste buds. Now, my favorite is Susquehanna because it's so few seeds and it's so sweet. And some people now, it's got a rich flavor for a pawpaw, and some people like a milder flavor, and that would be Shenandoah, for instance. But I enjoy the rich flavor. I think this is what kind of happens to pawpaw eaters. Maybe you get attracted to, you become familiar with the milder ones, and then your taste for pawpaw grows, and now you're looking for that richer flavor. So Susquehanna is my answer. I can say that I have a friend who's been growing pawpaws. He has a 3-acre orchard of pawpaw varieties, and his favorite is Allegheny. And then I know that for a number of people, Tallahatchie is a favorite. So they do have different flavor profiles. All of them taste of pawpaw. It's as hard to describe what pawpaw tastes like as is to describe a strawberry. But there is a unique flavor which we can just term pawpaw.
Could you perhaps describe for our listeners who maybe want to plant 1 or 2 in their yard, and just a note here that you generally, with the exception of a few cultivars out there, like sunflower, for example, you generally need 2 trees for cross-pollination. Mm-hmm. Could you just describe some of the differences between your different varieties and some of the kind of standout characteristics of each cultivar?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start by describing Shenandoah, which is one of my favorites. It's a milder flavor. It's a large fruit. All of my fruits are very low end seedy. Because that was a very important trait to me. Shenandoah has a kind of a very pale green skin when it's ripe. It often gives you only 1 fruit on a stem. And this can be very favorable that in harvesting from the tree, which you don't have to wait, you don't have to pick it off the tree. You can let it ripen and it will fall off the tree. Of course, it can bruise when it hits the ground. Maybe you'll have grass growing under it and that'll cushion it. But if you're picking from the tree, if you've only got 1 fruit growing on the stem, then you can clip the stem. When it's in a cluster, you have to rip the fruits away from the stem, and that leaves open, it tears the skin. There's an opening to the flesh. And this is where you could start to get some rot going in there. So that's just to describe Shenandoah. I kind of like the fact that many of its fruits will just be hanging one. Almost all the other pawpaws you will encounter in the trade have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fruits in a cluster. I describe Susquehanna, which has a rich flavor and is very sweet, very few seeds, and it's a denser flesh than many. Pawpaw flesh, if we haven't already mentioned this before, has a texture very much like custard, like flan, and that's kind of exquisite. I mean, it's the very opposite of a crunchy fruit, but it's quite delectable. Yet these fruits that have that soft texture, of course, bruise easily. Susquehanna is firmer. I compare it to the texture of a Hass avocado, which, is not hard and crunchy, but yet it's firm. The Potomac is notable for the sheer size of the fruit. It's very similar to Susquehanna in many ways, and it's also larger. Not uncommon to have fruits that weigh more than a pound. But now when you have a fruit that weighs a pound, that's more than a single person serving. And in some ways, it may be better to have Allegheny, which is a smaller fruit, early ripening. I should have mentioned that Shenandoah is one of its unusual characteristics is it's both early and late. It has a long fruit season. So it can be one of the early ones to harvest fruit from, but it also can extend all the way through September and be late. Susquehanna is a late ripening variety, and that's not suitable for the northern zones of our country. So that's to be borne in mind. The Wabash is very round shaped. Dr. Pomper at Kentucky State University thought we should call it Wabash because it looked like a cannonball. There's that song about the Wabash cannonball. It has a deep orange flesh. Oh my golly. Let me talk quickly about Rappahannock. Rappahannock I chose because its flavor profile, hard to describe. It's really hard to describe flavors, don't you think? But it seemed to have kind of a bright, less complex flavor than most of them. Pawpaws, when you eat them, it's almost like wine. You get an initial flavor burst on the front of your tongue, and then it gets in the middle of your mouth, and the full flavor is developing. And then when you're done, there's a long finish, a distinct aftertaste. And that's of course, I guess that's one of the beauties of pawpaw flavor is it's a complex flavor. So this Rappahannock struck me for its being kind of, only words I think of is clean and bright and more simple than the others. Tallahatchie, well, Tallahatchie has an interesting story. It's really an exquisite flavor. It was in my top 9 in orchard number 1, but I didn't like it for one reason. I didn't release it. It was not one of my first releases. It was my last release. Tallahatchie, rather early to ripen, but the clusters were always big. And it's so painful to pick from the cluster because fruit in a cluster, I've yet to find a pawpaw tree where the fruit within a cluster ripens on the same day. So I'm picking from the same cluster day after day until it's all finished. And I would be in the row picking fruit. And I would have gone over the Tallahatchie tree. It only had a number at that time. It was 1035. So I'm picking over the tree, and I swear I've picked all the fruit that's ready to pick, and it's in my bag, and it's in my sled that I haul down the rows. And I've gone to the next tree, and I hear kerplop behind me from the tree I was just at, because one of the clusters that I tested every fruit and I picked from, now the cluster's center of gravity shifted because I took out that big pawpaw, right, and shifted. And now with the center of gravity being different, one of the fruits decides to drop. And so it's dropped on the ground, and certainly you can't sell it because it's been touching the ground. And it's a wasted fruit. So I didn't like that about Tallahatchie, but the flavor is good. So years later, so we're going back now about 5 years ago, I get phone calls and emails from 3 different people in 3 different states wanting to know, tell us about 1035, because I've been in the orchard. There were different universities growing out these different named or these different numbered trees for evaluation across, in different regions, which is one of the final steps you should take in breeding. As a aside, a tree that, whether it's apple or whatever it is, that performs well on your farm, in your county, in your state, there's no guarantee it's going to do the same way when you move it hundreds of miles to a different state. So that's why you have these different orchards. Now, back to the story about Tallahatchie. So I'm getting 3 different phone calls from 3 different people who've tasted it in these university orchards, and they want to know about 1035. And I say, wow, they obviously really like it. This is the universe telling me that this particular tree is an important one, and I need to reconsider. And I didn't really need any more than that. I've reconsidered it. I have to propagate it and release it because people like it. Because they're walking through those orchards that have 20 different pawpaw varieties in the orchards, and that's the one that's standing out to them. So that's the story behind Tallahatchie. It has an exquisite flavor. And one of the people at Kentucky State University years ago was always telling me, whenever you make pawpaw ice cream, you got to include 1035 in the ice cream. So that's now Tallahatchie.
That's a really, really fantastic story. Thank you so much for all of that detail. I have only 3 questions left, just on the topic of like festivals and products. And then some people have allergies and people are concerned about annonacin, squamosine, and then about where people can purchase them. Those are the last 3 topics I wanted to cover. So on the topic of pawpaw products and also pawpaw festivals where people can try these products, people are brewing pawpaws into beer, making ice cream, and in some cases making some other foods. I've heard some concerns about baking them into bread because dried pawpaw can upset people's stomachs sometimes.
Upset is a mild word for what happens. Yeah.
So I'd like to hear more about that, and also if we could just talk about some of the products, if you have any favorites or what some people have been doing with products. Mm-hmm. And on the topic of festivals, where people can, what festivals you could go to try some of these products.
Yeah. Well, let's start, I guess, with festivals. The Ohio Pawpaw Festival is the original one and still running, started in 1999 in eastern Ohio. Town of Albany, which is very close to Athens, Ohio, is a well-rounded festival that covers couple acres, all manner of things, from selling pawpaw trees and other native trees, a large beer garden, a toy train that's by toy train, it's big enough the kids ride in the cars. So that's entertainment. There's different crafts and stuff being sold. There's a pawpaw tent where contests are held for the best tasting pawpaw or the biggest one. And they have a silly contest for pawpaw eating. So who can eat a pawpaw the fastest without using their hands, so they have to just stuff their face into the plate to eat the pawpaw. Pawpaw t-shirts are sold, and it's all manner of things. It's been a very big hit, and it certainly has popularized pawpaw in Ohio to the point that the state legislature chose to designate Asimina triloba as the official native tree of Ohio. They already had an Ohio fruit tree, but this would be then the official native tree. There is a festival happening in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That's been going on for 7, 8 years, maybe 9 years. I lose track. There's one in York, Pennsylvania that's been going on for a while. Well, they're springing up all around the country. I can't keep track of them anymore. I'm sure there's one out in Missouri. I think there's one in Indiana. Oh, West Virginia has had one for about 6 years in Morgantown at the on the university property of their arboretum. I'll be talking there this year. I'll be there September 30th, and that's just a smattering. I know they're more widely spread because pawpaws grow from East Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, the Carolinas, up into Pennsylvania. They grow up into New York State. People I know in Vermont are successfully growing them. Some people in Maine are planting them. So, I mean, they're a very hardy tree. They're a very hardy tree. even though they're in a family, in the custard apple family, which is a very big family of something like 3,000 different species of in this custard apple family, and they're all tropical or subtropical, except for our native pawpaw, which has to experience winter to come out of dormancy and grow the next year. So you can't grow it in the Caribbean islands because it's been tried, and they grow well for 1 year and then they give up the ghost. So it's an unusual plant and a wonderful one. Now you were asking about how to find them to eat. Well, the festivals are obviously one of the best ways to go taste your first pawpaw and taste probably a selection of different varieties. Another way is farmers markets. The pawpaw is not suited, and this is both its advantage and its disadvantage. It's obviously because it's so perishable and it's fragile that you can't be shipping it across country and treating it like you do oranges and apples in a grocery store. But it's perfect for farmers markets. People coming to a farmers market, by and large, will never have tasted a pawpaw before. At a farmer's market, they can get a free sample. And then after they like the sample, they can buy the fruit. So, in a grocery store, you're not typically going to have any opportunity to get a free sample of this fruit you've never seen before. The farmers markets, it can be just a local farmer who doesn't, have to, he's just transporting it within the county to the market. So they're going to be in good shape. You mentioned ice cream. It's wonderful. It'll hold a long time, unlike the fruit. The fruit, if it's fully ripe, you can keep it refrigerated for 1 week and it's still in good shape. But that's its limit, refrigerated. If the fruit is underripe, as in you picked it from the tree, you didn't let it fall, you picked it from the tree, it was feeling soft, it wiggled a little bit at the stem. So these are all signs of softening, of ripening. It doesn't change color, not really. So you can't go by your eyes. It's really a matter of feel. But you pick it that way. Now it'll finish ripening in about 3 days inside the house. You can refrigerate it immediately, put it in the refrigerator, and it will hold for 3 weeks. And you can bring it out and it'll finish ripening. But if you exceed the 3 weeks in the refrigerator, things have biologically happened to it, and now it doesn't finish ripening. Beer, I don't know. Does it make a good beer? I'm not a beer drinker, so I don't know the answer to that one. Bread, yes, you can make a good pawpaw bread with it. But I found out, and everyone basically agrees with me, once you bake it in bread, now it tastes like banana bread. And I ask myself, why would I use pawpaws this way when I could just use bananas to make banana bread? Pawpaw leather, it seems like it is an obvious thing to do with it's soft. You can just smear it into a sheet, let it dry, and now you have pawpaw leather. But don't do that, because I know of 6 different people have thought of this idea and done it on their own. And and they say it tastes so delicious, and I believe them. It probably tastes really that much sweeter and delicious with a leathery texture. And about 30 minutes later, they are so nauseated and they're throwing up. And this would require food chemists to investigate why this happens. But I just send out a warning. I don't think I know of anybody who's made pawpaw leather that then didn't vomit rather forcefully. So that's a word to the wise. You were asking about these compounds which are called annonaceous acetogenins. The adjective annonaceous is because the custard apple family, botanically, its name is Annonaceae, so that's annonaceous. The acetogenins is a name for compounds that's determined by the chemist, how you should name the compound. These are present particularly in the leaves and the twigs and the seeds. They are pretty toxic, so they're one of the things how the tree prevents itself from being preyed upon by insects. But for the same reason, you wouldn't want to ingest a lot of it. The pulp will contain some of this, and it may be that some people react to it. Most of the people I know don't react to it, but there are always issues of food allergies. I mean, we consider strawberries, right, a safe fruit to eat, but there's some people who have strawberry allergies. I have a female friend who's allergic to oranges. She cannot eat oranges for that reason. So I think when trying something very new and different for the first time, you go a little bit slow on it, find out that your body accepts it and just, show kind of what I call normal concern and consideration when trying pawpaw for the first time.
I can attest to that myself, where I've eaten lots of pawpaws and never had any issue. But then I introduced them to a very, very close friend of mine, and she had stomach upset from eating it and has a bunch of food allergies and was just like, wow, I didn't like it. And, you never know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the other nonas and the group of the family that Pawpaw is in. As far as grafting goes, do you know if there's any compatibility between Pawpaws and anything else in that family, or are people trying that at all? I'm not sure what the purpose would be, other than maybe, I don't know if the rootstock could confer any sort of cold tolerance to the scion, or something vice versa, if you're trying to graft pawpaw scion onto some other related nonas.
I know a little about that. I'll relate my own experience. I'd heard that somebody had done, now we're going back into the 1980s, okay, when I was, had the two different orchards, and I also had some access to a greenhouse. Well, I tried growing cherimoya. Some of the related fruits in the annona family are really popular tropical fruits, and the standouts are cherimoya. It doesn't like intense heat and humidity, but it cannot take any freezing temperatures. And then there's soursop, which is also the Spanish word for it is guanabana, and that's popular in the Caribbean islands for sure. I was curious about cherimoya. I've eaten the fruit and it's super delicious. It has a lot more seeds than pawpaw has, but it's very, very delicious. Its region of origin is Ecuador, up in the higher elevations of Ecuador. So I did grow some cherimoya from seed, and then I tried grafting pawpaw onto it, and that worked. And it grew fine for a year, but the next year when it should have leafed out, it didn't leaf out, it died. And I think there are people who've done the reverse, grafting cherimoya onto pawpaw. As you said, what would be the purpose of this? I don't know, because the cherimoya can't withstand freezes, but they did it, and I think it was the same result, though, that it grew fine for 1 year, but then it gave up.
Well, it's good to know it's been attempted, but
it does bring up a thought here. Some people are wondering, well, why? Hey, can we hybridize cherimoya with pawpaw? Can we, hybridize annona with Asimina? Well, there's a difference in chromosome numbers. They differ by one chromosome, and that causes failure. There's an incompatibility just because of the chromosome difference.
Well, I think that we've really covered quite a lot of bases. This has been a fantastic interview. The last parting thing would just be to ask, where folks can purchase your varieties from.
For where they can purchase the trees, I recommend they go to my website, petersonpawpaws.com. I have many different pages there. One of the pages is purchasing. I'm not commercial, so I don't directly sell, but there's a long list with a map showing where these different nurseries are in the US and in Europe as well. The two different maps, Europe and North America. And it gives a list, which is probably now like maybe more than 30 different nurseries selling my varieties. So that's a very good way to find. I do emphasize that they sell out very rapidly, and most of these nurseries have a waiting list for the following year. I mean, so if you want to plant in October, it's probably too late to buy one of my trees in September. But you might be able to get one sent to you for the following spring, and spring's a great time to plant the trees.
Well, Neal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the interview.
It was a pleasure. And for listeners, we have a few topics to just cover quickly before the episode ends. Our apologies that we weren't able to discuss these topics in more detail. Although this episode that we recorded was very late in the evening, going until, almost 11 o'clock at night. But if you're interested in going to any pawpaw festivals in the next couple of weeks, the Ohio Pawpaw Festival is September 15th to the 17th. There's also the 8th Annual Pawpaw Festival in Frederick, Maryland, which is the same weekend, the 16th, and a Pawpaw Festival in Powhatan, Virginia, which is also on the 16th. There's just a lot of pawpaw events happening the same weekend. Fast forwarding to the following weekend, there's the first ever Pawpaw Festival in Louisville, Kentucky. On the 23rd, there's the Frederick County Master Gardener event, Pawpaws. A Little Known Treasure is the title of that, also in Frederick, Maryland. There's a farm tour for Pawpaws at West Farm Nursery in Branchburg, New Jersey, also on the 23rd, and the York County Pawpaw Festival in York, Pennsylvania. That's on the 23rd and 24th. Finally, it just goes on and on. There's so many pawpaw festivals on the eastern seaboard this time of year. The West Virginia Pawpaw Festival, that's on the 30th, and that's when Neal will be giving a talk on pawpaws. That's in Morgantown, West Virginia. Finally, there's a farm tour, Pawpaws at West Farm Nursery in Branchburg, New Jersey. This massive list of pawpaw festivals was gathered from encyclopedia.com. You should check them out on Instagram also, Encyclopedia. Would like to know more about them. I can't say too much about what they do or their focus, but it seems like they have some really cool stuff going on. On the topic of annonacin content, this is something that folks should look into on their own a little bit more. In this episode, we didn't get to dive super deep into it just because of time constraints. We were recording in the evening and we almost went until 11 p.m. But annonacin content in pawpaw is something to be concerned with. It is something to be cautious of. As Neal talked about in the episode, the annonaceous acetogen, it is in the leaves, it is in the tree itself. There is annonacin and squamosine content that is in the pulp of the pawpaw that is higher than any other Annona family fruit. And in some circumstances, it's not like super common, but there are recorded circumstances of people having reactions to eating large amounts of pawpaw. Even one study, which you can find yourself by looking up through Google Scholar or other, even just a simple Google search with the keywords of progressive supranuclear palsy and pawpaw, which talks about a specific individual who was in his 80s and was a pawpaw grower who potentially developed atypical Parkinson's from eating large amounts, almost 30 pounds a year, of pawpaw fruit. There isn't a large amount of information out there about this topic. It's still something that's being researched and really needs more research. But as Neal said in the interview, talking about just people's allergies, which is kind of unrelated to this, pawpaw seems to be something that you should eat in small quantities, seasonally, when it's ripe during the year, and maybe not something you should grow large amounts of and eat all yourself. Seems like something that you could share with friends and eat smaller amounts of, because there isn't really any research showing that if you eat small amounts of it, it has really negative effects on you. If you're interested in looking up more about the annonacin and squamosine neurotoxicity issues, you can use keywords in Google Scholar like annonacin and squamosine contents of pawpaw and their side effects. There are several studies out there, and as I said, they're still developing. There needs to be more research on this topic, but Kevin Tran is a lead researcher who's released 1 or 2 different articles on this. The cultivar mango seems to have the least amount of annonacin content, and the jury's still out. I think that more research needs to be done. Regardless, it is something certainly to look into. It depends on how risk averse you are. The way I think of it is everything in moderation. If you're going to have a few pawpaws a year, or even a decent amount, like a handful of pawpaws a year, it's probably fine. But if you're someone who's growing pawpaws and wants to eat them every single day of the year, there is not a lot of research out there showing what that effect may have on your body if you're somebody who wants to eat them every single day, 365. So that's all. Thank you so much for sticking around for this long after interview rant. We hope to see you next time, and I hope that you get to go to some of those pawpaw festivals because they sound really, really cool. Till next time.